Okay, our stopping rule is when Shane got here, so now we can start. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce Daniel Freund, returning. He's a CAM PhD. I won't try to remember which year he finished in because I'll get it wrong. That he's now the class of 1947 career development assistant professor at MIT in the Sloan School. He hasn't learned from me how to hyphenate, but we'll discuss that afterwards. And he's going to talk today about inefficiencies of dynamic pricing in ride-hailing.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction. I want to start by saying that the rule David taught me is that when it's ride-hailing system, then ride and hailing should be connected, and there's a hyphen.
Oh, he has a point. He did learn.
I'm not saying I'm getting it right in the slides throughout, but this is consistent with what you taught me. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I am very, very happy to have spent the day in Ithaca. I've gotten a really warm welcome, and it's been nice after the last year and a half to have my first post-COVID or during COVID, interim COVID, in-person talk be in front of a friendly audience today. I'll be talking mostly about a paper joined with Garrett that went on SSRN yesterday at around 6 p.m. So as of now, one can actually find it. I might get to joint work with Davide Crapi and Howie Ong, who both were at Lyft in the past, where I overlapped with them. And I almost certainly won't get to a paper with Chomsky that Chomsky and I are hoping to put online later this week. Viewed this way, if I do get to it, I have 2 slides on it at the end. If I get to it, then you haven't asked enough questions. So, okay. So the title is Inefficiencies of Dynamic Pricing in Ride-hailing. And before I get to the inefficiencies of dynamic pricing, it's probably worthwhile to think about sort of what does dynamic pricing in ride-hailing actually do? And in particular, what is sort of the idealized sense of what dynamic pricing in ride-hailing actually does? So I want to start with some sort of equilibrium models that come out of the literature that actually try to assert the rosy picture of what dynamic pricing can do in ride-hailing. For quite some time, everything is going to be very high level and conceptual. At some point, I'm going to get to an actual model, and there will be a proof sketch in this talk. But for now, please indulge me as we stay fairly high level. So the first sense in which there's an idealized equilibrium in the literature when studying ride-hailing is the idea that dynamic pricing can match demand and supply in real time. So if we think about our demand curve being decreasing in a price and our supply curve being increasing in the price, because if we have a higher price, more drivers are willing to join the platform, then dynamic pricing leads to a market clearing price that would be exactly where those 2 curves meet. This is pretty standard economics that allows for this match to happen in real time. If there's more demand than we can serve, dynamic pricing will basically make sure that that demand is deterred from requesting. And at the same time, dynamic pricing will lead to higher earning opportunities for drivers, which means that more drivers will join the platform and supply will increase over the long run. So that is one idealized equilibrium that we will get to over the next few slides in terms of to what extent is that actually maybe too rosy a picture of what is happening in practice. A second one is that dynamic pricing gives spatial incentives for drivers to reposition towards undersupplied areas. So this is the idea that dynamic pricing will be observed by drivers who see, oh, in this other location I might earn more money on a map that looks somewhat like this here. And then they will reposition in sort of the correct equilibrium manner with the right number of drivers going to each location so as to ensure that everybody maximizes their own earning opportunities at the location that they reposition to. I won't argue that these equilibria are completely unfounded in reality. That's definitely not the point here. There is, for example, the empirical work by Peter, who I thought would get a shout out because he's in the room, but I think he's only on the call, that identifies that these dynamic pricing signals do lead to drivers repositioning, but this equilibrium in which every driver takes the earning maximizing action for themselves, that I will be a little bit skeptical about in this talk, and you'll see in a little bit why. And then, and this may be the most celebrated result that came out of the literature, dynamic pricing solves the problem of wild goose chases. Now I know there's a fair number of people in the room who know what wild goose chases are. There are probably also quite a few who don't. I will explain it later in the talk. But these are maybe the three main effects that the literature analyzes when it comes to what happens thanks to dynamic pricing in ride-hailing. Now, I want to give one such example of a paper in the literature that analyzes dynamic pricing in ride-hailing. And it's a paper that I greatly appreciate. It definitely was my gateway drug into the ride-hailing literature. It's Sid's paper from EC 2015 with Ramesh Johari and Carlos Riquelme, in which they consider a threshold model of dynamic pricing, in which basically you have arrivals over time of drivers entering the platform, and you have demand coming in. And if the supply is below the threshold, the platform charges a high price, which deters some of the demand, so fewer people request, and the supply coming in leads to the number of idle drivers going in this direction. So if we're here, we have drift in this direction towards the threshold. Whenever we go above the threshold, the platform switches the price from high to low. Now more of the demand that comes in ends up requesting, so the drift goes into this direction. And on average, we'll be pretty close to the threshold because we end up with a random walk that concentrates around the threshold. Now, in this model that Sid and co-authors studied, they considered sort of a large market limit. And if you buy into that model, you really end up in a situation where the platform constantly, at speed going to infinity, changes the price between high and low, high and low, high and low. But at the same time, they assume a model in which the riders, the passengers, are completely myopic about their choices, in the sense that as a rider, I come in, I'm offered a high price. If I'm not willing to pay it, I just leave. I'll argue in 2 slides that I don't buy into that model, and you'll see why. But for the moment, let's first observe that if we look at pricing data on a platform like Lyft, for example, this is not meant to be an empirical representation. This is just sample data, 3 locations in the same city, 2-hour interval. It does go up and down pretty rapidly. So that is actually consistent with what the model says. We see prices go up, then they quickly fall again. There's a lot of up and down here. But if that's the case, then the assumption of the model is a little bit undermined. Why is that? Because the assumption of the model in that paper is that drivers will always accept whatever trip they're offered, and riders will accept the trip if their willingness to pay is above the price, and reject the trip otherwise. Now, there's a very nice paper by Nikhil, who I hope is on the call, because I'm very curious what he will think about this work. There's a very nice paper by Nikhil that came out in Management Science this year about how dynamic pricing incentivizes drivers to strategize about the timing of their ride acceptances. Why? Because if a driver gets a ride request, and that ride request is maybe with a low price, and the driver anticipates that in 2 minutes surge pricing will go up, then maybe there's a good chance that the driver says, I'm going to decline this request. Maybe I get another one in 5 minutes, and I'll make more money in the long run. there's a similar effect when it comes to repositioning. This I might get to in the second part of the talk, where dynamic pricing leads to drivers strategizing about where they should be relocating to. Yes, they want to relocate towards higher earning opportunities, but if dynamic pricing is as dynamic as we just saw it can be, then maybe you don't want to move to the high earning opportunity, because by the time you get there, you can't earn that much there anymore. And finally, and this is what I'll talk about for most of the talk today, it incentivizes riders to wait. So if I'm a rider on the Lyft platform and the price is high and I'm not willing to pay that much, or even if I am willing to pay that much, and I know in a minute I'll be paying significantly less, then why should I be paying the high price? I can just wait and pay a lower price in a few minutes. And that actually ends up happening. So this plot is the key motivation for the first part of the talk. And I want to explain what you're seeing here, because it's a little bit subtle. On the x-axis, I'm showing the percentage price markup on the price of a ride at the time that the app was opened. So over here are the prices that are just priced at the regular price. Here is 50% markup, here's 100% markup, and so forth. On the y-axis, I'm showing you 3 different plots that basically tell us how much time passed between the time that a rider opened their app and the time that they actually requested a ride. And as you can see, the 25th percentile of riders that request a ride, they basically spent the same amount of time regardless of how high the price is. So the time when they request is almost constant in the price that they observe. But if we look at the 75th percentile, we see an almost linearly increasing function. So when the price is high, people are inclined to wait. And I'm sorry that the figure doesn't show super well. Up here is 15 minutes. So here, for example, at a 100% price markup, people are already willing to wait about 5 minutes longer than they would be if there had not been any markup at all.
How do you rank linearly the riders?
So I'm looking at, for each time that somebody opened the app and ended up requesting, I'm looking at what was the markup at the time. That gives me buckets basically for each one of these verticals. And then I say, okay, for everybody that opened the app when there was no markup and ended up requesting, let's sort them by the time that passed between them opening the app and the time that they requested, and pick the 25th percentile, pick the 50th percentile, pick the 75th percentile.
So the ranking is different for different markup?
Yes. I'm not saying that this rider here and this rider here are the same riders. In fact, we might observe the same rider appear 10 times in this one and 15 times in this one.
A percentile of what?
Percentile of all times, if you want, that a rider, any rider, opened the app and ended up requesting.
I think Mikhail has a question.
Yeah, so I'm sorry if this spoils the result or like sort of the outcome, but is this before Lyft implemented the like way to get a cheaper
Yes.
trip?
Yes, it does spoil the outcome, and yes, it is before.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so people clearly engage in what we would call ad hoc waiting. And why do they do that? Well, on this plot I'm showing you the 25th percentile, and the reason I'm showing the 25th percentile is because it gives me a nice decreasing picture that is like consistently decreasing. With the 50th it would be decreasing, but not as smoothly. So on this I'm showing you the price that people ended up paying as a function of how long they waited before they requested. And what you can see is if the multiplier is low initially, then you can only save so much, because if you start at a multiplier of 50%, it drops to 0, and like there's no, it can't drop lower than that. But if you start at a multiplier of plus 200%, then you actually, if you wait long enough, will go down all the way to 0. So this waiting behavior seems to pay off for riders who engage in it, at least sometimes.
The question on Bobby is Bobby.
Yes, Bobby.
Oh yeah, Daniel, I wasn't going to bother you about this, but since you said something like people are clearly waiting because they see a high price when they open the app, I have to ask, did you actually attempt to show causation here? Like, did you control for the time of day when the app was opened and other factors that might explain this correlation without assuming a causal relationship?
Let me ask this way. Are you asking about the left or the right plot here?
The graph on the left.
Okay, for the left one, I'm on pretty solid ground. For the one on the right, there's a pretty bad selection bias that I would have gotten to in a second. The one on the left, yes. So if you slice it by time of day, if you slice it by city, the numbers will change, but the correlation will remain. But no, I'm not an econometrician, and I do not, this is not meant to actually prove causality. The one on the right, I will admit, there's a very bad selection bias in there, in that people who wait, if the price doesn't go down, maybe they just don't end up requesting at all. So, in a sense, this one has selection bias. That's why I'm saying it can pay off. I'm not saying it's guaranteed to pay off. Okay, so we have this waiting behavior. And what I want to do is I want to convince you that this waiting can cause an inefficiency in how supply is used. And I do that through a pretty simple fluid model. And through that same fluid model, I will then convince you that if we deal with our supply a little bit differently, and Nikhil also gave the lead away, it can instead be channeled into driving additional efficiency. But that requires deviating from the sort of standard dynamic pricing, which I will argue is sort of the SID model of the world, in which if supply is high, we lower the price, and if supply is low, we raise the price. At this point, I want to emphasize not only that all models are wrong, but also that some reflect the actual business financial metrics or financial terminology of a particular platform, and this one does not. So I'm speaking here as an MIT academic, and I'm not speaking in any way for any given platform. Okay, so before we go to the actual fluid model, I want to give a very stylized presentation of what could happen. So let's say we start with a low amount of supply being idle. So the number of drivers that are idly driving around, waiting for a ride, is small. And the platform wants to increase it. How does it do that? It charges a higher price. That higher price leads to two effects. Some people, actually it leads to three effects. One of them I'm not showing. Some people are deterred and they're leaving. They would have requested at the normal price, but now they just take a bike instead. Some request immediately. They say, well, the price is high, but I don't care, so I'm just going to request at the high price. And some people are going to wait. Those are the ones that we're interested in. Because those who wait and those that just are deterred from service, together will lead to the amount of idle supply increasing. Because that's why the platform increased the price. They want more idle drivers on the street. But if the idle supply rises, eventually there's enough idle supply present, and the platform will decrease the price again. But now the people that waited don't have a reason to wait anymore because the price is low again, and they will all request. But that leads to the supply being low again, and our price increases. So we get into this cycle of high and low prices and high and low supply, which is at least consistent with what we seem to see in the data in terms of very spiky prices. And if you buy into the stylized model, then you might believe that our supply will look something like this here. So we have some amount of idle supply that increases over time until the price is lowered, and then a bunch of people request simultaneously, and then the supply increases again, and then they request simultaneously, and so forth. Noticeably, this is not due to any stochasticity. Sorry, not due to any stochasticity in the system. This is really just due to strategic behavior on part of the agents who wait, on part of the riders that decide to wait for a lower price. So another aspect that's really important to ride-hailing operations, and this is where we get closer to the wild goose chase that I promised you earlier I would be explaining, is that spatial service systems fundamentally have to deal with what I call spatial friction. So Larson and O'Doney, in their Urban OR textbook from 1981, describe this expected time for a ride-hailing driver to pick up a passenger in a city as a function of the number of drivers that are idle driving around in the city. Why? Because if you have more drivers driving around idly, then the chances are that if you pick a point uniformly at random where somebody requests a ride, there will be a driver closely nearby. Whereas if you have only one driver in all of Boston driving around idly, then odds are that driver will be pretty far from where a request might pop up. Of course, Larson and O'Doney don't talk about ride-hailing. They talk about fire brigades and how close they are to the fire in the urban area. But the idea is the same. You have this inverse square root relationship. Now, why is that important? Because if we look at ride-hailing data, we observe more or less the same. We observe the time it takes drivers to pick up a rider is roughly inverse square rootish related to the time that it takes, to the number of drivers that are idle on the street. And this is from a paper by Carolco et al. From last year. If we look at a different version of the same plot, those two plots are next to each other, we can think about, well, what is the throughput of this system? And now I'm going to explain what the wild goose chase is. If you don't have any idle drivers in your system, every time a driver becomes idle, they're being asked to serve a request, and they drive across town to serve that request, and they spend as much time picking up the passenger as they then spent driving the passenger to their destination. And that leads to a fairly low throughput in the system because drivers are spending way too much time en route to a passenger rather than with the passenger. If you have more passengers instead more drivers instead be idle, then you don't end up with drivers spending nearly as much time en route to the passenger. Instead, they spend a little bit more time idle, but way less time en route to passenger, and the throughput of the system increases. So what we find is that having more idle drivers will actually increase the system throughput, and this area here on the left side is what we call the wild goose chase area, which is when drivers spend all of their time driving to passengers to pick them up, rather than spending some time idle and then most of the time actually with passengers. Now, the idea that comes out of this paper by Castillo et al., 2017, is that dynamic pricing moves the system from this place here, all the way on the left, over to the place on the right, by deterring demand and ensuring that some amount of drivers remain idle. Other questions on that? Because this is really important for what's going to come next. Are those two plots clear? Okay. So, what's the problem with our strategic volatility and this idea of wild goose chases? Well, I'm going to claim that Jensen's inequality tells us that dynamic pricing can't maximize throughput. And I'll try to formalize that in a fluid model in a moment, but I want to do it just pictorially. When we're over here and we lower our price because we have a lot of idle drivers, then a lot of people will request so that we end up over here on the left side, and then we increase our price again. And we end up moving back and forth between these two parts of the throughput curve that are not actually at the maximizing point. And Jensen's inequality tells us that this is a concave function, so taking any distribution around the maximizer won't be as good as being actually at the maximizer. So dynamic pricing cannot actually maximize our throughput if people engage in the sort of weighting behavior that leads to a volatile supply.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Wait, so what are you assuming that riders know? So like how?
Right now I'm not assuming anything yet. Right now I'm assuming that such behavior exists and saying if such behavior exists, then we can't be maximizing throughput. In a slide or two, I will give you a model, and then I'll be assuming things.
Okay.
Nikhil.
Yeah, so is this assuming that delta is like some like discrete quantity? Like would this go away as delta goes to 0?
Yes. But if delta goes to 0, then you would simultaneously have the time between these drops go to 0, which means either which basically means either you stop price differentiating, or the wait time is so small between two times when the low price is being charged that you destroy incentive compatibility of people not waiting. Let me get to that, okay?
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So let's give our fluid model.
Sorry, Daniel. I was going to pause, but I think I'm going to follow up on Phil's question. So I had the same one. So if you do this kind of bang pricing, then I agree with you. You have these kinds of volatilities.
Yeah.
Smoother pricing?
Say again?
Smoother changes in price?
So there are two ways of doing smoother changes in price. One is you update your prices every 2 minutes, as you currently do. That's what Uber says in their papers. They update their prices every 2 minutes. But you just react more slowly. That one works, but then you're acting with one hand behind your back because you're not reacting in real time anymore because the price that you charged 10 minutes ago, which was very high, is still restricting you to charge a high price now because you're smoothing the decrease. The alternative to smoother prices would be in real time. Basically, rather than every 2 minutes, update prices every 5 seconds and really allow that sort of smoothness that is just as fast as before in terms of like how fast you go from a high price to a low price, but you go in many small steps. That would work, and that breaks all of the results that I'm going to show, except for that's not how these systems are engineered. So if you were to engineer a system that updates prices much faster, and if you're okay with your customers being annoyed with the fact that they hit okay at one price, but by the time they actually requested the price check, if you're okay with that, then yes, then this won't hold anymore.
Thank you.
Okay. So the fluid model looks as follows. We have drivers arrive at a rate of mu, and this is an open system. So our drivers are going to arrive, they're going to be idle until they are servicing a ride, and then they disappear. We have riders arrive at different rates, I, for lambda I, for each type I. And each type I is characterized by 2 parameters beyond the arrival rate, which are the utility that they get out of service and the disutility that they get out of waiting. So VI will be the utility for service, WI the disutility per unit of time spent waiting. the platform, we'll assume for now, sets a high price and a low price and a control threshold. And the control threshold is the point at which supply is so high that the platform lowers the price again. And we will have an expected wait time, denoted W, that will arise out of equilibrium conditions. And the equilibrium conditions for a type I rider are basically, if my utility from requesting at a high ride, quasi-linear utility, my value for the service minus the high price that I'm paying, is greater than the utility from just leaving, which is 0, or the utility that I get from waiting and then requesting at the low price, which is VI minus the low price, minus my expected wait time, W, multiplied by disutility of waiting, W units of time in expectation. If this inequality holds, then a type I rider will request immediately, and we will use the fraction QIH to denote the fraction of type I riders that in equilibrium will end up requesting at the high price. Similarly, you can look at the fraction of riders that are willing to wait. For these, we have basically the same idea as before, except for if this quantity is larger than this one and this one, then people will request after waiting for the low price, so they will request after waiting and only pay the low price. And we will use the fraction QIL to denote the fraction of type I riders who end up with that decision. Okay. Now, the equilibrium sort of terms that we can derive from this are as follows. If we look at this picture, we have drivers arrive at rate mu. We have lambda I times QIH riders of riders of type I request at the high price, meaning whenever they show up, they immediately request. So the rate at which we increase our idle supply is mu minus the rate at which people request at the high price, which ends up being this here. This answers Chomsky's question from before. The wait time, or the time between two intervals, we assume is 2W, which means riders who appear know what the expected wait time is if they were to appear uniformly at random in such an interval, but they don't know when they are actually appearing. And then this delta, and I hope that this gets to Nikhil's question, this delta that the supply will drop by ends up being 2W times, in each moment during this interval, we have lambda I times QIL people show up in order to wait for the low price. So this drop ends up being 2W times the sum over I, lambda I times QIL. Okay. Questions on these dynamics?
Can I ask a question? Yeah, so in those last two lines of the slide, right, so W is the expected time, wait time, right? In one condition it appears linearly, in the other one it appears inside a convex function, right? So it doesn't bother you?
You mean that here it appears inside and here appears outside?
Right.
It does not bother. Should it bother me?
I think so, because sort of if I were a rider, I would perhaps estimate my whatever expected utility or something, right? Sort of.
So the expectation, like W, you should think of as being already the expectation.
Right.
So W.
The question is whether it should be inside or outside. So so I compare my actual. So if I wait, maybe 0 will feel better, right? If I wait, sort of,
Can we take this offline? Just because I want to manage my time reasonably, and I'm not sure I'm following the question in the moment. Okay, yeah?
Also, you assume that the cost for waiting is linear. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I don't know if it's reasonable, it's fairly standard. This actually goes back to Vickrey's 1963 paper on congestion pricing. And I will say that I agree with you that maybe it's not reasonable, but it's definitely a fairly standard assumption when studying weighting. There are sort of two standard models, I want to say. One is this one. The other one being the patience model, which basically says, I'm willing to wait 5 minutes at no disutility, but 5 minutes and 1 second, I'm not down for. So I actually like this one better, but I agree, it is also a stretch. Okay, so the objective that we'll define for the platform will depend on two cost terms, one being for inventory, one being for dispatch cost. So you can think of this as basically being the platform has some drivers and they pay for every minute that the driver is on the platform, regardless of whether the driver is idle or en route to a passenger or with a passenger driving around. That would give rise to these sorts of terms. The inventory cost ends up being proportional to the average amount of inventory, meaning the average amount of idle drivers. If you look back at the plot, we drop by 2W times this quantity. So the average value that we're at is theta, the amount from which we drop, minus W times the quantity. And the dispatch cost, we assume is idle in the amount, convex in the amount of idle supply at the time of dispatch. This is consistent with the ETA data that I've shown before. And then we get a dynamic pricing profit that looks like this here. And the key point, I don't want to stare too much at the formula, but the key point is the convexity in this part here of the expression, all the way on the right, would basically, if you think back to Jensen's inequality before, if you reduce the amount by which we drop, you would have less of a cost just by Jensen's inequality. And the solution that we propose is if instead of having people wait for the price to drop, you had them just say when they show up on the platform, I'm going to take the ride at a low cost after waiting in a FIFO queue, then you can keep your supply stable and you don't get this drop anymore. So our idle supply remains just constant at a threshold, and people who wait don't cause a drop in the supply because the idle supply because they are only served at the end of the queue when there's enough supply available without causing a drop. So I won't go through the proof sketch, but basically it boils down to showing that you can keep the same utilities for everybody involved, you can keep the same idle cost as in dynamic pricing, and the only thing that you then need is that Jensen's inequality gives you a lower dispatch cost than you would have had before. I won't go through the corollaries because I'm vastly out of time. And instead, I'll highlight, wait, no, I have until 5:15. I have so much time left.
Can we see the proof?
Say again?
Can we go back to the proof sketch?
It is really that straightforward. So it is really take the parameters from dynamic pricing. Everybody who previously waited, we'll still let them wait. Everybody who previously did not request at all, we have them make the same decision as before. And we'll make sure that everybody ends up with the same utility as before. And the degree of freedom that lets us do that is basically the length of the queue. So we'll make sure that the length of the queue, which determines how long people are going to be waiting, will be the same, will give us the same wait time with this queuing system as the wait time would have been with the dynamic pricing system. That ensures that all the utilities for all the decisions remain the same, so everything, all the incentive compatibility equations for the equilibrium are the same. Then we set our inventory level to be exactly this middle point of the dynamic pricing drop. and Jensen's inequality does the rest for us. Okay, the corollaries. We can change a bunch of things that we're assuming for simplicity. So in those slides, I just assumed like the 1 over square root dispatch cost, but anything that's convex would work. If riders have disutility for the ETA, so far I've been assuming that riders have disutilities only for the time they wait before requesting, but in practice they also have disutility for the time between when they request and when the driver shows up. This would still work. If the driver arrival rate is endogenous, rather than being this mu that is just given, assuming sort of standard assumptions in the literature that it's an infinitely inelastic, infinitely getting the term wrong. Assuming that the driver arrival rate is based on a fixed earning target rate, meaning when the earnings total on the platform increase, let's say, by 2x for all drivers, the number of drivers would also increase by 2x, then such an endogeneity would still give us the same result. And if we have a disutility for the variance in the wait time, then we need to adjust the queue a little bit, but we basically still get the same result. Now, all of this is nice, but at the same time, it's very dependent on this delta. And as Nikhil pointed out, at least implicitly I want to say, if this delta is small, then we don't get that much because Jensen's inequality is maybe not that big a gap. However, there's something more we can do. So we can allow our platform to allow riders not only to wait in a FIFO queue, but instead in what I call a spatial priority queue. So in this spatial priority queue, I won't be dispatching to riders based on whose turn is next, like who's waited the longest. Instead, I will dispatch based on what is efficient. What rider has a particularly efficient dispatch right now based on where drivers are closer nearby. Now I can still keep my idle supply constant at the threshold, but in addition to that, I have rider spatial density in addition to my driver spatial density. In the FIFO queue, I don't have that, and I just want to give a proof by picture of why this would be helpful. In the FIFO queue, I have all of these riders waiting in the queue, and I have my 2 drivers here, and this rider that is in black is the one that has waited the longest, so I need to dispatch to them. So I'll dispatch this car. In a spatial priority queue, I have all of these different riders that are in the queue, and I can dispatch to any of them. And this additional flexibility allows me to make more efficient dispatches. So, the effect of rider patience and efficiency, if we so want, is negative in dynamic pricing, because with dynamic pricing, we have the supply and volatility, and we get this inefficiency from Jensen's inequality. With the FIFO queue, we can cancel out this inefficiency, but we don't actually use the patience to make the system in any way more efficient. But with the spatial priority queue, we can actually leverage this patience to make the system be more efficient than it would be without patient riders. Okay, this is all nice as an analytic model, but it would be nice to have some estimates of, okay, how much of a difference do these things make? So we've calibrated some data for a very, very fictitious city. This is literally me looking at different parts of the literature where people estimated wait time disutilities for, I believe, the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, and estimated driver costs for the city of Seattle. And I'm just using various estimates that I can find, together with spatial sort of, together with the distances that we would get if our drivers and our riders were distributed uniformly in a unit square. So that is where this fictitious city, what this fictitious city looks like. I'm assuming, and these are entirely made up, that I have 1,000 drivers that have a cost of $30 per hour. This is based on Seattle city regulations. By default, I will assume that they are 60% utilized, meaning with a rider. This is based on New York City data in 2018. I'm assuming, and this is again made up, that the average trip time is 18 minutes. Why am I assuming 18 minutes? Because together with my 60% utilization, I get 36 minutes for 2 trips per hour, which will give me 36 divided by 60 is 60%. So I get exactly mu equal to 2,000. If that didn't make sense just now, don't worry about it. I'm really just trying to get parameters that are simultaneously embedded in what the literature says and reasonably easy to work with. I get these values for high and low values for service. These are based on just asking Uber and Lyft how much would an 18-minute trip cost, I believe also in Seattle. And I'm the 3/4 of type 1, 1/4 of type 2. That's totally made up. The weighting costs are based on this paper by Buchholz et al. That was using data from Prague. And yeah, the dispatch scalings are driven by points being uniformly distributed in the unit square. The point of all this being, this is very much a fictitious city. I'm not claiming that this is representative of any actual city. But those parameters, while made up, are also not entirely absurd. They have some embedding in parameters that have been established in the literature as being reasonable. Okay, so in this city, how much profit do I get? This is basically per hour. If I use the dynamic pricing mechanism that the fluid model basically showed, for which I've shown you the objective, I get $18,000 or $17,881 in profit for the platform per hour. If I make my dynamic pricing more efficient using batching as a dispatch technology, that increases to $18,000. Using batching here seems to make an awful lot of sense for the following reason. I'm assuming that all my patient riders who've been waiting for the price to drop request simultaneously. I should allow the platform to actually batch them together and optimally dispatch to them instead of dispatching to them greedily. So that's basically the difference between how these two compute the cost part of the objective. The FIFO queue gives me $18,800. That's about a 4% increase. That's not bad. The spatial priority queue gives me more than 20,000, which is about a 12% increase. So at that point, it's actually a very worthwhile thing to invest in. To give you some comparative statics, on these two plots, I'm varying the respective dispatch cost and idle cost. So these were 2 parameters in the model. As you can see, the purple line is actually the default value that I'd assumed before. As these grow large, on each plot I'm showing you the gap to the spatial priority queue, which will always be optimal. The gap grows large as either of the 2 parameters grows large. On this one here, I'm just scaling the market size as a whole. So I'm scaling the arrival of drivers. I'm scaling the arrival of riders of each type. Again, as it grows large, the gap to dynamic pricing grows, and it does so at a linear scale. On this one here, I'm varying the proportion of riders that are willing to request at the high price. And not surprisingly, when all my riders are willing to request at the high price, then the whole Jensen's inequality thing goes away, the whole spatial density goes away, because at this point, I don't have the drop anymore. Nobody's waiting. But you can see that the gap that I've described at this point here was actually very far from being as large as it could be. If I'd instead said, let's say only a quarter of my riders are of type 1 and 3/4 are of type 2, I would have seen a much larger gap. Okay. There are various robustness checks that we can look at numerically. For example, we can replace the fluid model by a stochastic one with persona variables. Everything looks shockingly exactly the same. I'm saying shockingly because I expected things to look roughly the same, but they really look exactly the same. We can replace an open stochastic model, we can replace such a stochastic model that is still open by a closed one that explicitly contains the spatial aspects. So rather than saying there's a dispatch cost, I will just say there's no dispatch cost, but if a driver is serving a longer ride or is serving a ride with a longer dispatch, then that rider will just be busy for longer before they become idle again. And the supply efficiency then translates into higher throughput. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but basically the light blue is the spatial priority queue mechanism. And as you can see, down here's the sort of all riders are impatient and request immediately. There's not much of a difference. Up here is the opposite regime where a lot of very few riders request immediately. And yes, throughput goes up as would be expected based on the fluid model. To get to Nikhil's question from much earlier, yes, this is before Lyft implemented this wait and save product. This is a quote from Logan Green, CEO of Lyft at the quarterly earnings presentation a year and a half ago. The idea of wait and save is exactly what I've described here, which is to increase the efficiency of driver dispatches by having people wait a few minutes and therefore get much more efficient dispatches than one would have otherwise. So, in conclusion, for part 1, dynamic pricing in ride-hailing naturally segments our riders into patient and impatient ones, just because whenever the price changes, there are people that would have, maybe at least in hindsight, been willing to do this wait. This is not accounted for in most of our models, and by our, I mean the OR and OM community that has been studying ride-hailing very actively over the last 6 years or so. Interestingly, this patience can cause inefficiencies, but importantly, we can also leverage this impatience to instead have it boost the system efficiency. I won't go into much on the second part, on the driver side of dynamic pricing. Let me just highlight sort of a few ideas here, which are sort of these questions that drivers need to answer in their daily operation about what they should be doing in certain situations. So here I'm showing you only a part, only a sliver basically, of the plot that I showed you before. And imagine the blue price is, or the blue markup is here, the green markup is here. And a driver may be posed in that situation with a request coming from the green square, from the green location, where the markup is lower than in the location that they are in. Should they accept that request, yes or no? On the one hand, better request no now than maybe no request later. On the other hand, in the blue location, prime time is higher. It turns out if they don't accept, shortly thereafter, the markup drops significantly in both locations. But that's sort of a stochastic optimization problem that you wouldn't be able to solve instantaneously. And I want to say it's a stochastic optimization problem which the literature tends to assume people solve rationally with full knowledge of everything. So the sort of equilibria that are often assumed don't necessarily arise. I think Nikhil's paper did a large step in explaining that. There are other similar situations that arise when it comes to just repositioning, when it comes, and this is one that I'm feel most strongly about when it comes to repositioning. So we have 4 drivers here. They all get the same price signal from these 2 locations. And the equilibrium assumes there's going to be 2 going to the up location and 2 going to the down location. And if those 4 were able to discuss their decisions with each other, then that's a reasonable outcome. If they were playing some best response dynamics, it would be a reasonable outcome. But they're making one-off decisions. And then it becomes a very hard to believe outcome, in my opinion. So what Lyft did would, I'm not going to read out that quote, but it's a quote by a driver complaining about this exact situation. What Lyft did is they developed this product called Personalized Power Zone that tries to instead give incentives that are sort of more static and don't change as often on the driver side, instead of giving this dynamic pricing incentive, which changes way too often in order to allow proper strategizing around it. Won't go through the details of how it works to be respectful of your time, but designing it comes with a lot of optimization questions that had to be solved in the process. Let me skip over the results and get to the second conclusion of this talk, which is, in the literature, we often assume idealized equilibria that don't necessarily arise in practice because the marketplaces that we've created by now are way too fast-paced for these equilibria to actually arise. Dealing with these situations then requires its own set of challenges that one needs to deal with. And that's not only through optimization, that's not only through market design, that also require things like UX design or product management, things that are definitely outside our area of expertise, but that's where a different set of skill sets needs to come together to tackle these market challenges. I'll stop here. Thanks for having me.
So in your stylized example, you saw increases in something good on the order of something like 10%.
Yeah.
And I think the answer to my following question is no comment, but which is completely valid, right? But at Lyft, when you ran some experiments, what did you see?
The answer to that is 100% no comment, except for that you work for Lyft also, so why don't you just look up the internal documents? Yeah, as I said, this is not with my Lyft hat on, and I'd get in trouble for saying
Absolutely.
any proper answer to you.
Question online. Mike Todd has a question.
Yes.
Mike, go ahead.
I had to unmute myself. This may not be appropriate or not, but I was just trying to look at this at a high level. And just the notion of equilibrium seems maybe putting too much faith in equilibria because your market is so incomplete in terms of the goods. This is a very dynamic market, and going right back to Harold and De Boer, goods are meant to be goods at a particular location, a particular time, contingent on a particular state of the world. And it seems to me that all of your solutions here are introducing new goods which are based on state of the world and so forth, and therefore getting closer to a true equilibrium and the sort of welfare efficiency arguments that follow from having a true equilibrium.
So I will say, first of all, I agree with that comment. I appreciate it. I will say that I feel like I'm cheating a little bit because I'm starting by saying that the original models assume equilibria, but those equilibria are completely unreasonable to arise in practice. And then I'm introducing my own equilibria, and I'm hoping that you don't notice that those are also unlikely to arise in practice. But I appreciate Mike's comment. I do hope that they are more reasonable to arise than the earlier ones. Yeah?
Do the spatial priority queues have a time component too? Or
Say-
is the spatial priority queues, is the priority also based on the time in which people came into the queue? Because it seems like someone could have to wait for everybody
In practice or in theory?
in theory.
No.
I mean, in the
Yeah, so actually this was among the most useful review responses that I've gotten ever was when we submitted to EC, one reviewer actually expressed, why doesn't variance of wait time play a role? So it's actually reasonable to assume that like waiting until infinity in the spatial priority queue, which happens with probability 0 to infinity, but like that is not accounted for. What you can do is you can basically say, well, let's do the spatial priority queue unless somebody has waited twice the expected time. And then you'll still get some of the spatial priority benefits, but you won't have ever the experience of somebody waiting more than twice the. So there are fixes to it.
Question online.
Yes? To the online question?
Yeah, there are two, so you need to decide who goes first.
Whoever comes first alphabetically.
You are the priority queue.
Whoever comes first alphabetically, is that reasonable?
First or last name?
Peter.
Maybe I forgot to look over there.
Mike already asked the question.
Yeah, Mike already asked.
So Peter? Peter, we can't hear you, but you do seem to be unmuted.
Peter's not very good with technology.
Oh, yeah, I can't figure out technology. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Ah, wonderful. Okay. My question is about the relative importance of the efficiency benefits that you get from having people wait when it's beneficial from a spatial point of view versus the benefits to revenue that I imagine you get from a price discrimination, point of view, that basically you had one product and now you're separating that product into two products, and then you can charge more for the low wait time, the low wait time product. And yeah, so I don't know if you can comment at all, maybe not about that in the context of Lyft data, but maybe based on just what's in the literature for kind of estimates of parameters?
So I can answer to it fully within the context of my model. So I'm implicitly assuming that dynamic pricing already reaps the benefits of price discrimination, because people with dynamic pricing are already waiting. So the difference is just that in the dynamic pricing world, it's this ad hoc waiting, and in the queuing setting, it is this new product, but the choice set for each customer coming in or for each rider coming in is actually the same. They can request at the high price and get instantaneous service, or they can wait, and then after the wait, get a ride at the low price. Does that make sense?
I guess it does, but I have a follow-up question, which is it's not clear to me that in the dynamic pricing setting that the platform is extracting as much revenue as possible through that mechanism from the riders. Is that true? Like, are they doing that optimally?
I would sincerely doubt it. I want to say we were trying to get at, and this is actually a valid point, what we were trying to get at is that fundamentally there's a gap to how much dynamic pricing can do. So we're comparing queuing optimally implemented to dynamic pricing optimally implemented within the fluid model that we study. But you're right that there's an assumption, like we're not assuming that in practice this segmentation in dynamic pricing is done optimally.
Yeah, and it would be, I don't know, I would be interested in knowing whether, like, maybe the way to phrase it is, if you prevented your wait and save from gaining any efficiency, from gaining any welfare through better matching, if you could prevent it from that, but then look at the lift in revenue associated with price discrimination, that would just be interesting.
I think you could get the answer by switching ride-hailing companies, but you can't get it from me.
Fair enough.
And I think we should take the rest of the questions offline, given the time. Thank you very much, Andy.